until it, yeah, okay,
Oh,
we're
okay.
good. All right, review for the exam for Friday. And this is probably gonna be the biggest one, but it's really a little bit bigger than the first one was, in the sense that we got chapter 5, chapter 11, chapter 12. It's everything that says number 2 up there. Nothing from the first exam is up there, and nothing from the scenario that I'm giving you back this week is up there as well, okay? So right there, that should be a lot of good news, and that should narrow some things down. What I'm gonna do is we go, and I'm gonna write the exam tonight. I'm going to write the exam tonight, I'm going to print it out, and I'm going to send you out an email, number 1, that's going to remove some chapter questions. There's probably like 30 chapter questions that are in the 3 chapters altogether. I'm going to remove some of those, and in fact, there might even be different ones removed from the different classes. So I'll send you out an email that removes some of those. There aren't that many articles, so I may not remove many of the articles. I'm going to remove probably some of the terms though, and I'll send you that out as well, and I'll do that to my best ability tonight. I'm also going to do my best to upload the review session tonight. So if you got any questions, let me, obviously let me know on this. Now, as we get started with this, civil rights is basically the first chapter that we had dealt with after. It was the first chapter that we had basically dealt with after the midterm, after we finally got to having normal weather instead of all this snow. Does anybody have any questions about any of these terms from chapter 5? But not everybody at once. Yes?
Logos?
Logos. Remove logos. I told you I was going to cut logos this time, and it was going to be dealing with political incorrectness as far as logos are concerned. Yes, Evan?
ADA?
ADA was the Americans with Disabilities Act. And if you remember, when we were going through the chapter, chapter 5, there were a couple of quotes that I had read off that were actually dealing with ADA.
Was it the old people?
What's that?
Was it the old people article?
No, it wasn't the old people, but this was actually from page 111. I had read this off and I said the crowning piece of legislation for Americans with disabilities was the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. On 111 it says it guarantees access to public facilities, workplaces, and communication services. No longer can the stairs, telephones, and buses that kept this minority group out of schools, offices, theaters, and restaurants be used as excuses to deny access. The statute required schools, governments, and businesses to make existing facilities accessible. Wheelchair ramps and grab bars and restrooms have become common sights on the American landscape since 1990. So that was ADA. Do you remember when I had told you the story what the width of an aisle is supposed to be?
3 feet.
The width of an aisle is supposed to be 3 feet, and if you remember, it was the wheelchair guy in Pittsburgh that drove through the Pier 1 and broke things all over the place that taught me the painful lesson that the aisle had to be a minimum of 3 feet wide. What else have you got as far as questions?
13th Amendment.
What was the 13th Amendment?
Free slavery.
Yeah, it was. The 13th Amendment was the amendment that ended slavery, and that's really all that you need to know on that. There were 3 Civil War amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th, and the 2 that we really focused on in class were the 13th, which ended slavery and involuntary servitude. Can you think of another example where we talked that the 13th Amendment would prohibit? It wouldn't just be slavery, but maybe a more modern example? Talking about sports?
Oh, college football.
We didn't talk about that, although that might
Was
be...
it like the uniform?
What about the
Oh.
uniform?
Their dress code.
The dress code?
No, it wasn't. That is an article in this chapter. If you remember, I think I had mentioned to you if an athlete held out when they were under contract, they could not be forced to work to honor the contract because that's considered involuntary servitude. So that would not be allowed under the 13th Amendment. Do you remember what the 15th... Go ahead.
So was that like the lockout, like when the NFL had the lockout, and like when the NBA had like the players like they held that?
No, that's actually just organized labor doing that. The union's doing that. But like if somebody is holding out because they signed a 6-year contract and in year 2 or 3, they're now all of a sudden not paid as well as they thought they were when they signed it, they have the right to hold out individually. The team cannot make them work to honor the contract because that's involuntary servitude. Do y'all remember the 15th Amendment? Because this was a big one.
Giving voting amendment?
Did it give them the right to vote?
Voting can't be denied
Denied.
based on race.
Yeah. Race, color,
or previous service.
or previous condition of servitude. And this is the thing on this, and the way that you worded this is really important. A lot of people think that the 15th Amendment gave the freedmen the right to vote. It did not give them the right to vote, but rather what it did is it gave you reasons why you could not be denied the right to vote, and the 3 specific reasons were race, color, and previous condition of servitude. Now, I had given you some examples of some tests. Well, actually, there were 2 things that we did with this. One was I asked you to write an amendment, and there was some poor sucker in all the classes that had to do it. And basically, the amendment typically was, all freedmen shall have the right to vote, or something along those lines. That's a positive giving of the right to vote, and there would be no disputing it. But when you say the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, then that means that other things could be used to deny the right to vote. So do you remember the tests that we talked about?
Soap bubble test.
What was a soap bubble test, Effie?
How many bubbles were in like, they would
A
show
bar of
like the
soap?
bubbles, yeah, and then they would ask someone like how many bubbles are in there.
And is it possible to know?
No.
It really is. And this is where I kind of got perverted. And I would ask somebody if they showered that day, and then if they were a bar soap or a gel person. I probably shouldn't be saying this on film. But if you remember, then I'd asked you, well, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? And you're right. There's no way that you could really ever answer that question not correctly. And if you did answer it, you really wouldn't know for sure, because some of these bubbles are so damn small, you're not going to know that they're really there. So when you put this into context, basically they would ask you how many bubbles are in a bar of soap, and if they wanted you to vote, then yes, you would be allowed, and if they didn't, then no, you wouldn't. And if you remember with this, are you being denied the right to vote on account of your race, color, or previous condition of servitude? In a way, you really are, but they're giving you another factor, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap, because typically they would let the whites vote and they would not allow the blacks to vote. Or they would allow the wealthy to vote, but not the poor whites and not the poor blacks, that kind of a thing. Can you, go ahead, Brian, yeah, I saw your hand.
The grandfather clause?
What was the, excuse me, the grandfather clause?
If your grandfather was a slave, you weren't allowed to vote?
Basically, they said that if your grandfather could vote before slavery was revoked, then you would be allowed to vote. And if your grandfather couldn't, then in fact you couldn't. Now, this one was the one that I think when I had mentioned this in class, this was the one that was most dubious. But not all of the poor whites would have been allowed to have voted at that point. So maybe it wasn't solely based on race. But the fact is that they were clearly targeting the black grandfathers that couldn't vote, meaning now their grandchildren would not be allowed to vote. But it wasn't just race, color, previous condition of servitude. It was your grandfather's ability to vote, which, like I said, that's pretty dubious. You're squirming. Go ahead.
Is another, is like a literacy test?
Well, how'd the literacy test work?
If you couldn't like sign your name or something, or you couldn't vote?
Actually, they give you a passage. And if I wanted you to vote, I would actually give you a very, very easy passage. If I did not want you to vote, I would give you a more difficult one. And the trick with these things, and remember the amendment says race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Let me stress, they did not just deny blacks the right to vote. They denied whites the right to vote too. So they were discriminating against both of them, quite frankly, but blacks were more likely to be denied the right to vote. So if I wanted you to vote, I would give you the cat in the hat. You know, and I know Dr. Seuss wasn't around then, but something the equivalent of that that's very, very easy. And if I didn't want you to vote, I would give you a law. I would give you a legal document. I would give you something with big words in it. And then, in fact, hell, I might not even know what those words meant. But if I gave this to you, then I could just tell you you didn't know what it was. And to be honest, most of the people really didn't know what it was, so it's not like they're going to put up a big fight. So there was the literacy test, there was the grandfather clause, there was a soap bubble test. Can you think of any others?
Jelly bean.
What was the jelly bean test then?
How many jelly beans in a jar?
And did you actually get to count them?
No.
You'd have to look at a pretty big sized jar and you would have to eyeball it and say. And like I said in class, you know what? The person that was actually administering the test might not have any idea how many jelly beans were in there, so they're going to tell you no matter what you said because they didn't want you to vote, or they would tell you, yeah, that's right, if they did. And that's kind of the bottom line. And if by chance they did know, and in fact you did get it right for some crazy chance reason, they might eat one right out of the jar and say, no, you missed it by one, and then in fact you're not going to be allowed to vote. So the jelly bean test was one. And if you remember, I think I had shown you the clip. How many licks does it take? Do you remember? How many licks does it take to get to at the center of a Tootsie Roll Pop? And to me, the soap bubble test and even the jelly bean test to a certain extent, really hard to measure those kinds of things. And the owl basically said it was 3 licks. Yeah.
Can you explain the Missouri Compromise?
Well, hang on. There's one more test. There was one more test, and it was kind of an obscure one. The poll tax. And when I had mentioned this, I explained to you that in the South we have a poll tax that deals with strippers, P-O-L-E. But for voting, it's P-O-L-L. And the idea is they might charge you a certain amount of money to be able to vote. Oftentimes it would be $5. And let's be honest, $5 is pretty good on the dollar menu today. $5, if you go back 150 years, would actually be a pretty good a pretty good sum of change. So with this in mind, a lot of people, again, poor white and poor blacks, they would be disenfranchised because of it. Go ahead, Missouri Compromise. You know what? Don't worry about the Missouri Compromise. Let's take off Missouri Compromise and let's take off logos from this. Any others?
Sexual harassment.
Sexual harassment. I think I may do parts of that every day when I talk about your boots. I mean, and you're wearing boots again today. If you want to zoom in on the boots, that's okay. I ask you the question, what did we talk about? What did we talk about when we were talking about sexual harassment?
Like how there's a lot of things that could be considered sexual harassment
What's the key?
if the person feels uncomfortable.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. So, you know what? I can say things in front of the room. I can say things in front of the room. And when I say these things in front of the room, it doesn't matter if everybody except Steffi is totally comfortable with these things. But if Steffi is the one that's uncomfortable with them, then guess what? That would be a situation of sexual harassment. It kind of goes back to the part when we were talking about political correctness. When we were talking about political correctness, if you remember, it's not how you want to be treated. It's not how you think other people would want to be treated. It's not how the majority wants to be treated. But you've got to deal with each individual person. So whether it's sexual harassment or whether it's, some of the things dealing with DOA that we had talked about or dinosaurs on standardized tests, the trick is it's how each individual person views something. And if they view it poorly or they disagree with it or they're offended by it, then that's a potential lawsuit, again, dealing with race or gender, disability, orientation, sexual harassment, and we could go on and on with this. And I'm going to probably have a couple of questions that are going to deal with this kind of correctness or harassment in some form. Some form. And I may not use Steffi's boots. What other questions do y'all have?
You do Dred Scott real quick?
What was the Dred Scott case?
Legalized slavery?
What's that?
It legalized slavery?
It did. This was the slavery case. This is considered, Dred Scott was the worst case, the worst decision by the Supreme Court in American history, in part because it legalized slavery, in part because it led to the Civil War. So the Supreme Court decided that they were going to solve the slavery issue once and for all, and I guess they did, but they solved it by leading to the Civil War, which actually ultimately solved the issue. Who was Dred Scott, and what was the arrangement?
When the master would die, he said that Dred Scott would be freed.
That's right. Dred Scott was the slave, and Dred Scott, there was basically an understanding that when the master, the male owner, died, that in fact Dred Scott would be set free. Did the widow, I'm trying to get my words right, did the widow have a problem with this deal, or was she trying to help Dred Scott?
She was trying to help.
How did it work?
He said that if I just let you free, then you could be retaken to slavery. So how about you sue me, right?
Yeah, it was an organized or an arranged case. And the idea in this basically was Dred Scott, she was worried that he could be kidnapped and then taken below the Missouri Compromise line. So if he was above that line, he's a free man. But if he was kidnapped and taken south, then in fact he would be a slave again. And she wanted to have not just her, the will that basically, willed him to be free, gave him this status, but she wanted to know that he would be free no matter where he was. So she decided not to free him so that he would sue her. Do you remember what the court held?